The year was 878. Vikings dominated England. The kingdom of Wessex stood on the brink of collapse. Its king, wounded and isolated, hid in a marsh, surrounded by enemies on all sides. It seemed like the end, but this story was only beginning. Alfred the Great wasn't just a king. He was the last man standing against the Viking invasion, a brilliant strategist and a visionary who transformed England forever. But how did a defeated king become the only English monarch to be called the Great? Imagine a 9th century England drowning in chaos. Northern kingdoms had already fallen. Alfred's brothers had died one after another in desperate battles. Now, betrayed by his own nobles and driven from his throne, Alfred retreated into the misty swamps of Somerset with just a handful of loyal men. In those dark waters, most kings would have surrendered, but Alfred was different. From those marshlands would rise the architect of England's salvation, a man who would not only drive back the Viking hordes, but would revolutionize warfare, education, and governance. A ruler who would lay the foundations for what would eventually become the English nation we know today. Did you know that during his darkest days, Alfred disguised himself as a common peasant? Legend tells us that while hiding in a peasant woman's cottage, she scolded him for letting her cakes burn while he was lost in thought, planning his next move against the invaders. This king, who had lost everything, humbly accepted the rebuke, never revealing his true identity. If you love stories of resilience, strategic brilliance, and kingdoms on the edge of destruction, don't miss this video. Like, subscribe to the Medieval Archives and discover how Alfred changed the course of history. What would you have done in Alfred's position? Surrender to the seemingly unstoppable Viking force, or risk everything on one final, desperate gamble? Stay with us as we journey through one of history's greatest comeback stories, the tale of the king who saved England when all hope seemed lost. Alfred was never meant to wear the crown. As the fourth son of King Ethelwulf of Wessex, born in the year 849, he grew up in the comfortable shadow of his older brothers. The succession was clear. First Ethelbald, then Ethelbert, then Ethelred. Young Alfred was free to pursue his passions for learning and literature, a rare luxury for a prince in the violent 9th century. But fate had other plans for this unlikely king. While still a child, Alfred's father took him on a remarkable journey to Rome. Imagine this, a young Anglo-Saxon boy traveling across a dangerous medieval Europe, marveling at the remnants of the ancient Roman Empire, and finally kneeling before Pope Leo IV himself. The Pope, seeing something special in this child, performed an unusual ceremony. He anointed Alfred and made him an honorary consul of Rome. It was as if destiny had marked him even then for greatness. Back in England, Alfred watched as Viking raids transformed into full-scale invasions. These weren't simple pirates. They were organized armies led by skilled commanders with one goal: conquest. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell: Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia. Only Wessex remained standing, and one by one Alfred's brothers took the throne and died defending it. First Ethelbald, ruling for just 2 years after their father's death. Then Ethelbert, lasting only 5 years before falling. Finally, Ethelred, Alfred's last living brother, took the crown in 866. Alfred fought loyally at his side, learning the brutal art of war against the fearsome Viking warriors. In 871, during a desperate battle at Merton, King Ethelred was mortally wounded. Imagine the weight that fell on Alfred's shoulders that day. At just 22 years old, this scholar prince, who never expected to rule, now inherited a kingdom on the brink of annihilation. Within the month, the new king was forced to fight 9 major battles against Viking armies. 9 battles in a single year. Most kings might fight that many in a lifetime. Where his brothers had failed, Alfred somehow survived. Not always winning, often retreating, regrouping, and fighting again another day. What he lacked in experience, he made up for in determination and a brilliant tactical mind. The crown Alfred received wasn't made of gold, but of iron necessity. Wessex didn't need a traditional king anymore. It needed a survivor, a fighter, a leader who could adapt to this new and terrible reality. And in this reluctant fourth son, they found exactly what they needed: a king born to fight, not by design, but by desperate circumstance. As Alfred later wrote in his translations of ancient texts, in prosperity, a man is often puffed up with pride, but in adversity, he discovers the greatest consolation in the good qualities of his soul. The reluctant king was about to be tested by adversities few monarchs in history have ever faced. January 878, the dead of winter, King Alfred's fortunes had never been lower. It happened during Twelfth Night celebrations, a sacred time when Saxons would feast and make merry after Christmas. The Viking army, led by Guthrum, chose this moment deliberately. While Alfred and his nobles celebrated at his royal estate in Chippenham, the Vikings launched a surprise attack, but this was no ordinary raid. It was a calculated strike made possible by treachery. Several of Alfred's own nobles, men who had sworn oaths of loyalty, had secretly aligned with the Vikings. Imagine the shock and betrayal Alfred must have felt as enemy warriors stormed his halls during a time of feasting. With barely any warning, the king was forced to flee with just a small band of loyal men, abandoning his royal treasures, his records, and seemingly his kingdom. The Vikings believed they had dealt the final blow to Wessex. Their strategy was brilliant: cut off the head, and the body would follow. Without Alfred, resistance would crumble. They hunted him relentlessly across the winter landscape, confident it was only a matter of time before the last Saxon kingdom fell completely under their control. But they underestimated Alfred's determination. The king disappeared into the marshlands of Somerset, a vast, forbidding landscape of water, reeds, and mud that few dared to enter. This wasn't merely a hiding place, it was one of the most hostile environments in all of England. In winter, bone-chilling fog rolled across the wetlands. What little solid ground existed became islands in an ever-changing maze of water channels. It was here, in this desolate place, that Alfred made his stand. The Isle of Athelney became his makeshift fortress, barely more than a patch of slightly elevated ground surrounded by nearly impenetrable marshes. From this humble base, disguised as a common man, Alfred began to gather intelligence and rebuild his forces. Loyal men from Somerset, Hampshire, and Wiltshire slowly found their way to him, arriving in small groups to avoid detection. And it was during this darkest period that one of history's most charming legends was born. While hiding in the cottage of a local peasant woman who had no idea of his true identity, Alfred was tasked with watching her cakes baking by the fire. Lost in thought, planning his comeback against overwhelming odds, he allowed the cakes to burn. The woman, returning to find her ruined dinner, scolded the distracted peasant harshly. "Can't you watch some cakes? You're quick enough to eat them when they're done." Imagine that, the rightful king of Wessex, humbled before a common woman, accepting her rebuke without revealing who he truly was. This tale resonated so deeply with the English people that for centuries afterward, the phrase, "Don't burn the cakes like King Alfred," became a common saying, reminding everyone that even the greatest among us can fail at simple tasks. What makes this story so powerful isn't just its humor, but what it reveals about Alfred's character. Even at his lowest moment, having lost his kingdom and living as a fugitive, he maintained the humility to accept criticism from a peasant woman. No wonder the English would later call him great, but make no mistake, while hiding in these marshes, Alfred was far from defeated. In the mud and mist of Athelney, surrounded by enemies, with most of England believing him dead or defeated, Alfred was planning something that would shock the Viking world and change the course of English history forever. Spring, 878. After months of hiding in the marshes, Alfred was ready. While the Vikings thought him defeated, he had been meticulously planning what would become one of the most remarkable military comebacks in medieval history. Word spread through secret channels across Wessex. "The king lives. Meet at Egbert's Stone." This was no small risk. If the Vikings discovered their gathering point, the rebellion would be crushed before it began. Yet from farms and villages across the countryside, men loyal to Alfred slipped away to answer their king's call. At Egbert's Stone in early May, Alfred emerged from hiding to find something remarkable, an army waiting for him. The men of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire had not forgotten their king. The Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, stood ready to fight for their homeland once more. What happened next stunned the Viking world. The Norsemen under Guthrum were camped near Edington, confident and comfortable, believing Alfred's threat eliminated. They had spent months pillaging Wessex without organized resistance, but now Alfred led his forces in a lightning march to confront them. Imagine the shock of the Viking sentries seeing a full Saxon army, battle-ready, appearing on the horizon when they believed that army no longer existed. The battle that followed was brutal and desperate. These weren't professional soldiers, but farmers, blacksmiths and merchants fighting for their homes against the most feared warriors in Europe. The Viking shield wall, a formation of interlocked shields that had broken armies across England, stood firm against the initial Saxon charge. But Alfred had studied the Vikings for years. He knew their tactics, their strengths, and crucially, their weaknesses. The battle raged for hours as the Saxon forces hammered at the Viking lines. What made the difference was Alfred himself, fighting in the thick of battle, visible to his men, shouting encouragement in their desperate moments. One contemporary account claims he never left the front line, his sword rising and falling with a fury that inspired his men to superhuman efforts. Finally, the Viking shield wall cracked, then broke. What followed was not just a retreat, but a rout. The Saxons pursued the fleeing Norsemen all the way back to their fortified camp, where the survivors barricaded themselves inside. But there was no escape. Alfred surrounded the camp and settled in for a siege. After 2 tense weeks, with no supplies reaching them, the starving Vikings faced a choice: die fighting or surrender to Alfred's terms. Here's where Alfred showed he wasn't just a warrior, but a statesman of extraordinary vision. He could have slaughtered the defeated army. It would have been expected in that brutal age. Instead, he offered terms that would transform the political landscape of England. Guthrum, the Viking leader, would renounce his gods and convert to Christianity. He would be baptized with Alfred himself, standing as godfather, an incredible symbolic act, making them spiritual kin. The Vikings would withdraw from Wessex entirely and settle in East Anglia, creating a buffer zone that would become known as the Danelaw. Think about the brilliance of this solution. Alfred knew he couldn't eliminate the Viking presence in England. There were simply too many of them constantly arriving from Scandinavia. Instead, he turned enemies into grudging allies through religious conversion. By making Guthrum a Christian, Alfred gave him a face-saving way to retreat while creating a spiritual bond that made betrayal more difficult. The baptism ceremony itself must have been an extraordinary sight. Imagine Guthrum, the fearsome Viking warlord who had nearly conquered all of England, standing in a stone church, being baptized in the Christian faith with a new Christian name, Athelstan. His 30 most important warriors were baptized alongside him. Alfred lavished gifts on his former enemy, sealing their new relationship with the traditional bonds of medieval gift-giving. Would you believe this former pagan who had terrorized Christian England for years eventually died a Christian ruler of East Anglia? That's the power of Alfred's political genius. Did you know that Alfred used religion as a political weapon in one of history's most brilliant diplomatic moves? What would you have done in his position? Would you have shown mercy like Alfred, or would you have sought revenge against the Vikings who nearly destroyed your kingdom? Comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the medieval world. The Battle of Edington wasn't just a military victory, it was the turning point that saved Anglo-Saxon England and set the stage for everything that followed. Alfred would go on to build fortified towns across his kingdom, create England's first navy, and establish a renaissance of learning and literature. But none of that would have been possible without the brilliant strategy and leadership he displayed in those decisive weeks in May 878. From a fugitive hiding in marshes to a triumphant king dictating terms to his enemies, all in the span of a few months. This is why history remembers him as Alfred the Great. Victory at Edington wasn't the end of Alfred's story. It was just the beginning. While most kings throughout history are remembered for a single great battle or conquest, what truly made Alfred great was what he built during the peace that followed. The Alfred who emerged from the marshes of Somerset was a transformed man with a vision that extended far beyond merely surviving the next Viking raid. He understood something profound. Wessex, and England itself, needed to change fundamentally if it was to endure. First came defense. Alfred looked at his kingdom with fresh eyes and saw its vulnerabilities. Saxon settlements were scattered and unprotected, easy targets for Viking raiders who could strike anywhere along the coast or rivers. His solution? A network of fortified towns called burhs, strategically positioned so that no settlement in Wessex was more than 20 miles from a fortress. Imagine the enormous undertaking, designing and building dozens of fortified towns across southern England, each with earthen ramparts, wooden palisades, and eventually stone walls. These weren't just military installations. Alfred designed them as living communities with markets and churches. He calculated precisely how many men were needed to defend each foot of wall, and assigned specific regions the responsibility of providing those defenders. The meticulous Burghul-Heidege document still survives, showing exactly how many men each territory needed to supply for defense. But Alfred wasn't content with just building walls. He completely reimagined Anglo-Saxon military structure. Before him, armies were temporary, farmers and craftsmen who would gather when needed and then return to their fields. Alfred created England's first standing army, with half the men serving while the other half maintained the farms and towns. This rotation system meant Alfred always had trained soldiers ready to respond to Viking threats within days, not weeks. And then, in a stroke of genius that changed warfare in Britain forever, Alfred built ships. Not just any ships, warships specifically designed to counter Viking longboats. Larger, higher, and faster than the Norse vessels, Alfred's navy became England's first line of defense. The man who had once hidden in marshes had become the founder of what would eventually grow into the Royal Navy. Yet military innovations were only part of Alfred's vision. He understood that a nation needs more than just strong defenses. It needs identity, laws, and knowledge. During those dark years hiding from the Vikings, Alfred had made a promise to God that if his kingdom was restored, he would work to rebuild learning and literacy in England. He kept that promise in extraordinary ways. Imagine the scene: the King of Wessex, in the few quiet hours between managing defense systems and governing his kingdom, sitting with scholars from across Europe whom he had personally invited to his court. Together they translated crucial Latin texts into Old English, not for the elite, but so ordinary people could read them. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Gregory's Pastoral Care, Augustine's Soliloquies, philosophical and religious works that had nearly been lost during the Viking destruction. Alfred didn't just commission these translations, he worked on them himself, adding his own thoughts and interpretations. Can you picture it? A king with ink-stained fingers, debating fine points of translation with monks and scholars late into the night. He established schools and insisted that all freemen of adequate means ensure their sons learn to read English. In his own words, to have learning so widely spread throughout England that when boys grow up, they could be taught to read English writing. And then there was his greatest administrative achievement, law. Alfred gathered the various legal codes from Kent, Mercia, and other regions, combined them with biblical principles, and created a unified legal code for his kingdom. He removed outdated laws, clarified punishments, and crucially, emphasized justice over vengeance. For the first time, an English king declared that all free men deserved equal protection under the law. What's remarkable is that Alfred accomplished all this while still fighting off Viking raids. The peace after Edington didn't last forever. In 885 and again in 892, massive Viking armies returned to test Alfred's new systems. But this time, they found a transformed kingdom, organized, fortified, and ready. The burhs held. The navy intercepted raiders. The professional army responded swiftly. Alfred's reforms had created a kingdom that could withstand the storm. By the time of his death in 899, Alfred had laid the groundwork for something that had never existed before, a unified English identity. His son Edward and grandson Athelstan would build on his foundation, eventually uniting all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single English nation. But it was Alfred who planted the seeds, who first imagined what England could become. What's most extraordinary about Alfred's legacy is how personal it was. Unlike many kings who simply commanded others to build their vision, Alfred was intimately involved in every aspect of his reforms. He designed fortifications himself, translated books with his own hand, personally revised laws, and even invented a lantern that used horn panels to protect candles from drafts while allowing light through. A small invention from a mind constantly solving problems large and small. Alfred never actually ruled all of England. At his death, he was still formally just King of Wessex, though he had earned the title King of the Anglo-Saxons. Yet his vision extended far beyond the boundaries of his own kingdom to encompass something that hadn't yet fully formed. An England united in language, law, defense, and identity. This is why, over 11 centuries after his death, Alfred remains the only English monarch universally known as the Great. Not because he conquered vast territories or amassed personal wealth, but because he built something that would endure long after he was gone, the foundations of England itself. Throughout the long and storied history of England, spanning over 1,000 years of monarchs, only 2 kings have ever been awarded the title Great. Only 2 out of nearly 60 kings and queens. Think about that for a moment. What does it take to rise so far above your peers that history itself marks you as exceptional? Cnut the Great, or King Cnut as he was also known, earned his title in the early 11th century by conquering a vast North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. His achievement was one of military might and political dominance. At its height, Cnut's empire made him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. But Alfred's greatness came from something far more profound than conquest. When we look at English history, we find many kings who expanded territory, many who won famous battles, many who built grand cathedrals or castles. But Alfred stands alone because he did what no other monarch managed to do. He saved his nation at its moment of extinction and then rebuilt it into something stronger than it had ever been before. Consider this. When we look at other European nations, we find many great rulers. Russia had Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Prussia had Frederick the Great. France had Charlemagne, literally Charles the Great. These rulers expanded empires, modernized nations, and projected power. But English history is remarkably stingy with this title. Even the most celebrated English monarchs, Henry V, Elizabeth I, Victoria, never received the epithet Great. Why was Alfred different? The answer lies not just in what he accomplished, but in how he accomplished it. Alfred's greatness wasn't simply about survival against impossible odds, though that alone would be remarkable. It wasn't just about military innovation or his creation of England's first navy. It wasn't even about his legal reforms or defensive network of burhs. Alfred's unique greatness came from his understanding that national identity runs deeper than armies and fortifications. It lives in shared language, literature, laws, and learning. In the 9th century, most kings were illiterate. Even those who could read often saw no value in translating Latin texts into common languages. Knowledge was power, and power was to be hoarded by the elite. But Alfred had a revolutionary vision. He believed knowledge should be accessible to all people of adequate means, not just priests and nobles. When Alfred translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy into Old English, he wasn't just creating a text, he was making a statement that profound ideas should be available to his people in their own language. When he established schools, he wasn't just training future scribes, he was planting the seeds of an educated society. There's a famous story about Alfred and the Danish king Guthrum after their peace treaty. Alfred, hosting his former enemy at court, asked Guthrum what he thought made a good king. The Danish ruler reportedly answered, "Strong warriors and rich treasures." Alfred's response revealed everything about his vision of kingship. Books and learning make good kings, for those who cannot read the lessons of the past are doomed to fail their people in the present. Whether this exchange actually happened or was invented by later chroniclers doesn't matter. It captures the essence of Alfred's unique approach to leadership in an age of warrior kings. In his own writings, Alfred compared a wise ruler to a carpenter who gathers tools before beginning work. "A king's tools," he wrote, "are a well-populated land, brave soldiers and praying men. He must have these to fulfill his duties." But Alfred went further, adding that a king also needs wisdom from books, for, without wisdom, all other tools are useless. Perhaps the most telling indicator of Alfred's exceptional status comes from how he was viewed by later generations. While most medieval kings were remembered primarily by the church and nobility, Alfred's memory was preserved in folk traditions among common people for centuries, from the legends of him burning cakes to stories of him wandering his kingdom in disguise to learn of his people's troubles. Alfred lived on in popular imagination as the ideal king. By the 13th century, nearly 400 years after his death, chroniclers were already referring to him as Englen Herdere, Shepherd of the English. By the 16th century, he was being called England's Darling. And during the Victorian era, as Britain built its own empire, Alfred was celebrated as the embodiment of English virtues, wisdom, perseverance, justice, and learning. Alfred didn't just shape England in his own time, he shaped how England would see itself for centuries to come. When the Victorian historian Thomas Carlyle asked, "Who is England's greatest man?" he answered his own question. "Alfred, I think, if I were asked. Alfred, the builder, fighter, inventor, who could also write books and make laws." What makes Alfred unique among England's rulers is that his greatness wasn't dependent on military conquest or territorial expansion. While other great monarchs in history are known primarily for extending their power outward, Alfred's focus was internal, building the foundations of a civilization that could withstand the darkest storms. In the end, perhaps Alfred's greatest achievement was that he created not just a kingdom that could survive his death, but ideas and institutions that would endure for centuries. The legal principles he established, the value he placed on education, his belief that rulers should serve their people rather than merely exploit them, these concepts would resurface throughout English history, shaping the nation's development long after the details of his battles were forgotten. This is the true measure of greatness in a leader. Not just solving the crises of their own time, but laying foundations that benefit generations yet unborn. By this standard, Alfred stands not just as Alfred the Great, but perhaps as the greatest king England has ever known. As we reach the end of Alfred's remarkable story, we must ask ourselves, what truly makes a king great? Throughout history, Many rulers have conquered vast territories, amassed incredible wealth, or built imposing monuments to their own glory. But Alfred's greatness came from something far more profound. Alfred the Great proved that true greatness lies not merely in winning battles, but in rebuilding a kingdom from ashes. When we look at what he accomplished, creating England's first navy, establishing a network of fortified towns, reforming the legal system, promoting education and literacy, we see a king who wasn't just fighting for survival, but building for eternity. Consider where Alfred began. A sickly fourth son never expected to rule, inheriting a kingdom on the brink of annihilation. From those desperate beginnings in the marshes of Somerset, where he hid with just a handful of loyal men, Alfred rose to become the architect of England's salvation. What makes his achievement truly extraordinary is that he did all this while still fighting off Viking invasions, even as he translated Latin texts by candlelight, designed fortifications and reformed laws. Enemy raiders still threatened his shores. Alfred never had the luxury of peace, yet he built as if peace were guaranteed. His story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, when all hope seems lost, a leader with vision and determination can change the destiny of an entire people. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind more than just a defended kingdom. He left the foundations of what would become the English nation. Perhaps the most powerful testament to Alfred's greatness is that over 11 centuries after his death, we still tell his story. From the legend of the burned cakes to his brilliant victory at Edington, from his educational reforms to his legal code, Alfred lives on as the embodiment of wise and just leadership in turbulent times. In an age when most kings were remembered only for their battles, Alfred is remembered for his mind, his mercy, and his vision of a better world. As he himself wrote in his translation of Boethius, "Power is never a good unless he who has it is good." Alfred understood that true greatness comes not from conquering others, but from serving them, a lesson as relevant in our time as it was in the 9th century. I hope you've enjoyed this journey through one of history's greatest comeback stories. If you've been inspired by Alfred's resilience and vision, please take a moment to like this video, share it with friends who appreciate epic tales from the past, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the medieval world. What do you think made Alfred truly great? Was it his military genius, his educational reforms, or perhaps his legal innovations? Let us know in the comments below. And if there's another medieval figure whose story you'd like us to explore, tell us who it is. Until next time, remember Alfred's example. Even in your darkest hour, with wisdom, courage, and determination, you can change the course of history. This is the Medieval Archives, bringing the past vividly to life.